In the last video, we looked at how to create a new entity and made it ready to persist to the data store. In this video, we're going to look at how to actually persist to the data store, and this is done using repositories. Repositories are a convenient abstraction over Objectify that remove a lot of boilerplate for standard data store operations. Repositories also integrate with App Engine's built-in search capabilities, which we'll cover in more detail later on. At its simplest, a repository implementation looks like this. We start by extending the base repository, and there's a couple of choices here. There's a string repository and a long repository, which are fairly self-explanatory. They reflect the type that you've chosen to use for your ID on your entity. So because we're using a string, we use the string repository. There's also a key repository, which we'll cover in more detail later. You'll see the compiler complaining about not having a constructor because we actually need to pass some things through. For now, we're going to stick with an OArg constructor, but our superclass actually expects us to pass through the entity type, so the class object for our entity, and a search config. If you actually have search index fields on your entity, then you'll need to pass something here. But for now, we can actually just pass null because we won't be using it. So that's our repository. It's pretty simple. And with it, we can now save our entities like so. So if we just went into a basic controller, we could do something like this. Let's just say so that's all it takes to actually persist something to the data store. You'll see we use the put, we put a new user object in, and we'll get our persisted user object back from the repository. Except that this actually won't work yet. Try it, and Objectify will actually throw an exception. There's one important step we've left out. Objectify requires that we register all new entity types with it prior to persisting the entity. Registration looks like this. So we could do that there, but it will complain that we've registered the class multiple times. There are various strategies that we see employed to do this. The safest one is to put it in your application module file. So here in the configure block is actually the safest place to register user. Servlet startup is the recommended way to do this because it happens once and it's guaranteed to happen before you try to do any operations on it. Using things like static initializers isn't safe because classes are loaded on demand, and so there is a very real possibility that you try to load a related object when retrieving something from the data store, and Objectify doesn't know about it yet. So just if you want to be safe, do it here in the configure method. While we're here, it probably makes sense to also do the work of injecting our user repository so it can be used in other places. Inject can take an instance like that, and it also expects the interface. This is part of Thunder's dependency injection machinery, but you don't have to use an instance here. You can actually just let Thunder take care of the initialization of that thing by just passing through a class. So if your repository doesn't require any special initialization, ours doesn't, we can simply just pass that in. So we can go back to our controller now, and rather than create our user repository here in the controller method, because it's now part of the dependency injection context, we can declare it as a dependency here in our controller's constructor. And get rid of the initialization there. And then whenever the index method is called within our controller, it can call upon the user repository and it would put a new user with this email address into the data store. Every time it would get called, it would get a new ID though, because we're generating IDs on the fly. And we haven't done anything yet to guarantee that emails are unique. We'll have a look at that in a later lesson. And there you have it. A simple repository with basic CRUD properties that we can use to put and retrieve objects.